On the morning of December 30th, 1918, a young woman named Mae Capone walked into St. Mary's Star of the Sea Catholic Church in Brooklyn and became a wife. She was 20 years old. The man beside her was 19. The ceremony was modest. The parish was the same one where she had been baptized, where she had taken her first communion, where her family had marked every significant moment with quiet Catholic ritual. By every visible measure, it was an ordinary neighborhood wedding. What the church record does not note is that the couple's son had been born 2 weeks earlier. Albert Francis Capone, already alive, already named, was waiting somewhere outside that ceremony while his parents formalized what his existence had already decided. Mae wore white. That detail is not offered here as irony. It is offered because Mae Capone would spend the next 68 years of her life managing the distance between appearance and reality with a discipline so complete that most historical accounts struggle to find her at all. She gave no memoirs. She granted no interviews. She appeared in photographs usually at an angle, or slightly behind, or turned just enough that her expression was difficult to read. What remains is a life lived almost entirely in the margins of someone else's story. And within those margins, a particular kind of damage that money made easier to sustain and harder to escape. This is where that life begins. The neighborhood where Mae Capone grew up was not poor in the way that invited sympathy, and not comfortable in the way that invited envy. It occupied the particular middle ground that defined much of Irish Catholic Brooklyn at the turn of the 20th century. Stable enough to maintain appearances, precarious enough that appearances required constant maintenance. Her father, Michael Coughlin, worked steadily. Her mother, Bridget, ran the household with the kind of efficiency that left little room for sentiment. There were other children. The apartment was clean. Sunday Mass was not optional. These were the parameters of Mae's earliest understanding of what a life in good standing looked like, and they were parameters enforced not through cruelty, but through the quiet, persistent pressure of a community that watched. Irish Catholic Brooklyn in 1900 was a world organized around visibility. Who attended which parish? Who showed up at whose funeral? Which families kept their stoops swept and their children dressed on Sundays? Respectability in this context was not an aspiration. It was a form of survival, a way of distinguishing oneself from the waves of newer immigrants who continued to arrive and whom the established Irish families regarded with a complicated mixture of solidarity and alarm. To slip from respectability was not merely a personal failure. It was a failure that reflected backward onto parents, forward onto siblings, and outward into a social network that had long memories and few mechanisms for forgiveness. Mae absorbed this without being taught it explicitly. Children raised in such environments rarely need explicit instruction. The lessons arrive through texture, through the way a mother's jaw tightens when a neighbor's daughter is mentioned, through the particular silence that follows certain names at the dinner table, through the understanding that some things are never discussed outside the family, and some things are never discussed inside it either. She was, by the accounts that exist, a pretty girl. Light-haired, fair-skinned, quiet in the manner that her community coded as appropriate rather than withdrawn. She finished school. She attended church. She socialized within the boundaries her family and her parish defined. There is nothing in the record to suggest she found these boundaries oppressive. There is also nothing to suggest she examined them. This is not a criticism. Mae Capone, at 16 or 17, had no particular reason to examine the world she had been handed. It functioned. It provided a script. The script ran school, then marriage, then children, then the management of a household, then old age within the same community, observed and observing until the end. Thousands of young women in her neighborhood followed this script without incident. Many of them lived long, unremarkable lives within it. The script was not cruel. It simply left very little room for anything that did not fit inside it. What the script did not account for was a boy named Alphonse Capone, who arrived in her life somewhere around 1916 and who fit the script just well enough, at first glance, to pass. He was from the neighborhood, or close enough. His family had settled in Brooklyn after arriving from Naples, and the Italian and Irish Catholic communities in that part of Brooklyn occupied overlapping social geography without fully merging. There was friction, occasionally. There was also proximity, and proximity in dense urban neighborhoods tends to produce its own outcomes regardless of what either community's elders would prefer. Al Capone was not yet the figure history would make him. He was a teenager with quick intelligence, easy charm, and connections to street life that were real but not yet catastrophic. He had worked for a time at a candy store and a bowling alley. He had run with a gang called the Junior 40 Thieves, a juvenile affiliate of the Five Points Gang, which was itself connected to figures whose names would eventually become significant. But in 1916, none of that was visible from where Mae stood. What was visible was a young man who was attentive, who made her laugh, who came around consistently enough that the courtship began to take on the shape of something serious. Her family's response to Al Capone is not documented in any source that has survived. What can be reasonably inferred is that the Coughlins were not enthusiastic. The Italian-Irish divide in Brooklyn was not trivial. A daughter bringing home an Italian boy raised, however Catholic, however employed, however charming, was a complication. Whether this resistance was expressed openly or through the particular cold politeness that families like the Coughlins deployed in place of open conflict, it would not have been invisible to Mae. That she continued seeing him anyway is one of the few decisions in Mae Capone's early life that carries any legible weight. It is tempting to read it as rebellion, but that framing probably imports more agency than the situation contained. More likely, Mae was 19. The relationship had progressed past the point where reversal was socially simple and the pressure running in one direction, from her feelings, from Al's persistence, from the physical fact of what had already happened between them, outweighed the pressure running in the other. By the time she understood the full shape of what she had chosen, the choosing was largely done. What she carried into her marriage from those Brooklyn years was a specific set of tools: the ability to maintain composure in public regardless of private circumstance, the discipline to keep family matters inside the family, the understanding that respectability was something performed as much as lived, and the deep structural belief that loyalty, once given, was not something a woman in her community revisited. These were not weaknesses. In the world Mae Coughlin grew up in, they were survival skills of the highest order. They would serve her. They would also hold her in place long after the situation that required them had become something her younger self could not have imagined. The neighborhood she left behind when she eventually followed Al to Chicago was still there, still organized around the same Sunday masses and swept stoops and careful silences. Some of the women she had grown up beside lived their entire lives within 6 blocks of where they were born. Mae would live in Florida, in a house behind a gate, beside a man whose name appeared in newspapers in ways that required her to develop an entirely new relationship with public language. But in Brooklyn, before any of that, she was simply a girl who had learned very early that the most important thing was how things looked from the outside, and that the inside was a matter to be managed privately, quietly, and alone. Al Capone in 1916 was not yet dangerous in any way that announced itself. He was 17, broad-shouldered, with a manner that people who knew him in those years consistently described as warm, genuinely warm, not performatively so. He told jokes, he remembered names, he had the particular social intelligence of someone who had grown up reading rooms rather than books, and who had learned early that likability was a resource as practical as money and considerably easier to deploy. He had left school at 14, which was not unusual in his neighborhood, and had cycled through a series of jobs that kept him moving without anchoring him to anything: the candy store, the bowling alley, a paper route. Brief stints in other directions that the historical record does not fully account for. What the record does establish is that by his mid-teens he had made contact with Johnny Torrio, a Brooklyn-based organized crime figure who ran operations under the umbrella of the Five Points Gang, and that this contact was not incidental. Torrio recognized in Capone something useful: not just muscle, which was plentiful, but intelligence combined with social ease, a combination that was considerably rarer and considerably more valuable. Mae almost certainly did not know this in 1916. Not the details anyway. What she would have known, what anyone in that neighborhood would have known, was that certain young men ran with certain crowds, and that some of those crowds had edges to them. This knowledge existed in Brooklyn the way weather exists, as background condition, not always remarked upon, not always the basis for decision. Young men from her neighborhood, who had connections to street life were not automatically disqualified from marriage into respectable families. The calculus was more complicated than that. Employment mattered. Family name mattered. Whether the young man in question seemed likely to settle mattered most of all. Al, when he was around Mae, projected settledness. He was attentive in the specific way that counted in her social world. He showed up, he was respectful to her family, he made his intentions legible without being crude about it. He was also funny, and this is probably not a trivial detail. Mae Coughlin's life would not contain very much lightness, and Al Capone in those early years represented something genuinely alive in a social environment that prized decorum over vitality. He was not what the script had described exactly, but he was close enough, and he was present, and presence counts for a great deal when you are 19 and the alternative is waiting. What Al knew about himself in 1916 that Mae did not know is harder to establish, but some things are documented. He had contracted gonorrhea by his mid-teens, which suggests a sexual history that preceded Mae and that he did not disclose. He was already embedded, at least peripherally, in criminal operations that would only deepen as Torrio's influence expanded. He had a temper that he managed well in social situations, but that surfaced under specific kinds of pressure. A temper that would eventually produce the 3 scars on his left cheek, acquired in a knife fight at a Brooklyn dance hall after he made a remark to a young woman whose brother took offense. The scars came before Mae, or at the edges of before. The timeline is compressed enough that it is difficult to know exactly what Mae saw and when. What is known is that by the time their relationship was serious, the scars were there, and that Al's explanation for them shifted depending on who was asking. To some, he said it was a war wound. To others, he offered nothing. Mae is not recorded as having discussed the scars at any point in her life. This is worth pausing on, not as a dramatic detail, but as an early instance of a pattern. Al Capone's life was full of things that required an adjacent explanation, a softened version, a silence. Mae's particular skill, already developing in those Brooklyn years, was the ability to accept the version she was offered without pressing on its edges. Whether this was trust or pragmatism or something that had not yet been forced into a shape she needed to name is not something the record resolves. Their courtship proceeded through 1916 and into 1917, conducted within the social structures of the neighborhood. Church events, family visits, the kind of supervised proximity that Italian and Irish Catholic communities maintained as a formal gesture toward propriety, even when propriety was already somewhat theoretical. By 1917, the relationship had moved past the point of supervision in any meaningful sense. Mae became pregnant sometime in that year. The pregnancy did not produce a crisis in the visible sense. There was no rupture, no public scandal, no recorded confrontation between families. What it produced instead was acceleration. The wedding was set. The arrangements were made. Albert Francis Capone was born on December 4th, 1918. The wedding took place on December 30th, 1918. The 26-day gap between those two dates was not concealed exactly. It existed in the parish record for anyone who looked, but it was also not discussed, and in the social world Mae inhabited, the difference between something existing and something being discussed was the difference between a private matter and a ruined reputation. Mae understood this distinction with complete clarity. She had been trained for it since childhood. What she may not have understood in December of 1918, standing in St. Mary's Star of the Sea with her infant son elsewhere in the parish and her new husband beside her, was that the management of that 26-day gap was only the first in a sequence of gaps she would spend her life managing. Each subsequent gap would be larger. Each would require more elaborate maintenance, and each would be built on the foundation of the one before it. The accumulated architecture of things that existed, but were not discussed, of appearances maintained at the cost of whatever lived behind them. Al Capone, at 19, was already more than Mae knew. He was not yet what he would become, but the distance between those two states, between what he was and what she knew, was already established. It would only grow in one direction. Albert Francis Capone was born with congenital syphilis. This is a medical fact that took decades to surface in any public account of the Capone family, and it remains, even now, one of the least examined details in a story that has otherwise been picked over extensively. The condition, passed from father to child through the mother during pregnancy, meant that Al Capone had been carrying syphilis before his son was conceived, before Mae became pregnant, and almost certainly before the relationship became physical. It also meant that Mae had been infected. The disease moved in one direction through the family, quietly, before anyone in that household had a name for what was happening. Sonny, as Albert Francis came to be called, was not visibly ill at birth in ways that would have been immediately diagnostic in 1918. Congenital syphilis presented across a wide spectrum, and its effects sometimes took months or years to become apparent. What became apparent in Sonny's case gradually and then undeniably was a progressive hearing loss that would eventually leave him functionally deaf in both ears. The surgeries that followed, multiple procedures across his childhood and adolescence, were painful, only partially effective, and conducted against the background of a family secret that the surgeons treating him may not have fully understood, and that his parents never publicly acknowledged. Mae's own infection is documented in the medical record attached to Al Capone's later syphilis diagnosis, which noted that the disease had been present for an estimated 15 to 20 years by the time it was formally identified during his 1931 incarceration. The arithmetic places the original infection somewhere in the mid to late teens. Before the wedding, before Sonny, possibly before the courtship had fully solidified into something Mae understood as permanent. She never spoke of it. Not to journalists, not in letters that have survived, not in any recorded conversation. The silence is so complete that it is tempting to interpret it as ignorance, to wonder whether Mae simply did not know what had passed between her husband and her body and her son. But the medical history is difficult to square with total ignorance. Sonny's hearing loss required ongoing medical attention from early childhood. Mae managed that medical attention personally and closely. A woman of her intelligence navigating the healthcare system of the 1920s on behalf of a child with a serious and worsening condition would have encountered information. She may not have had the clinical language. She may have been told partial truths by doctors who were themselves operating within the discretionary norms of the era. But the complete absence of any expressed knowledge on her part is almost certainly not the same thing as the complete absence of knowledge. What it more likely represents is the same discipline she had applied to the 26-day gap between Sonny's birth and the wedding. The practiced management of information that could not be spoken because speaking it would require a response, and a response would require a decision, and a decision would unravel the entire architecture of the life she was maintaining. The wedding itself, small and parish-bound as it was, established the template. Mae's family attended. Al's family attended. The ceremony proceeded. Afterward, the couple moved into a house on Garfield Place in Brooklyn, a modest two-story building that the Capone family had occupied for some years. Mae moved into Al's family home, into his mother's domestic orbit, into the particular compressed intimacy of a multi-generational Italian household, where the rhythms and rules were already established, and where her own preferences were, structurally, secondary. Teresa Capone, Al's mother, was a strong woman in the specific way that immigrant mothers of that era and community were strong, which is to say that her strength expressed itself through the management of her household and her children, rather than through any form of individual assertion. She was not unkind to Mae. The two women maintained a functional relationship across decades, which is itself a significant achievement given the circumstances. But the Garfield Place house was Teresa's domain, and Mae's entry into it was on those terms. Sonny was an infant in that house, and then a toddler, and then a small boy beginning to show the first signs of the hearing loss that would define so much of his childhood. Mae nursed him through the early illnesses that congenital syphilis complicated. She managed his fevers, his ear infections, the worsening audiological symptoms that kept requiring new doctors and new assessments. She did this within a household that also contained Al's expanding criminal associations, men coming and going, conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, money that appeared without traceable origin and was not explained and was not questioned. Al, in these years, was moving fast. Johnny Torrio had relocated to Chicago in 1919 to take over operations for a gangster named Big Jim Colosimo. And the Chicago operation was growing in ways that made Brooklyn feel like a rehearsal. In 1921, a significant event accelerated everything. Al was involved in a violent incident in Brooklyn. The details remain disputed, but it was serious enough that Torrio strongly advised him to leave the city. The advice was not optional in any practical sense. Al went to Chicago. Mae, with Sonny, followed. The departure from Brooklyn was not a glamorous relocation. It was a rapid exit from a situation that had become untenable, dressed up in the language of opportunity. Mae packed up a life she had barely had time to establish and moved to a city she did not know, into a new phase of a marriage that was already built on foundations she had not been permitted to fully inspect. She brought with her the habits Brooklyn had given her, the composure, the discretion, the structural understanding that a wife's role was maintenance rather than inquiry. She brought Sonny, already showing symptoms that required medical attention she would have to find in an unfamiliar city. She brought the knowledge, however partial and unspoken, of what her husband carried in his blood and what it had already cost her son. And she brought the white dress, figuratively speaking, the ongoing performance of a marriage that looked, from the outside, like what a marriage was supposed to look like. Chicago was waiting. It would ask considerably more of her than Brooklyn ever had. Chicago in 1921 was a city in the middle of remaking itself, and the remaking was violent. Prohibition had been federal law since January of 1920, and the effect on organized crime in the city was not suppression, but acceleration. The infrastructure that had existed to move alcohol through Chicago's neighborhoods, the supply chains, the distribution networks, the arrangements with police and city officials, did not dissolve when the Volstead Act passed. It reorganized. The money that had moved through legal channels found new channels, and the men who controlled those channels found themselves managing operations of a scale and complexity that required something closer to a corporate structure than the street-level arrangements of the previous decade. Johnny Torrio was building that structure when Al Capone arrived. Al came in below Torrio, learning the organization from a position that required him to be useful in multiple registers simultaneously, as enforcer, as manager, as public face in situations where Torrio preferred not to appear. He was good at all of it. The intelligence and social ease that had made him legible to Mae as a viable husband made him valuable in an enterprise that ran on relationships, on the careful management of loyalty and threat, on the ability to read a room and determine in seconds whether the situation required charm or force. Mae arrived in this context and immediately began the work of making it domestic. The house Al established for the family on South Prairie Avenue was substantial, not ostentatious by the standards of what would come later, but well beyond what a 19-year-old from Garfield Place in Brooklyn might have expected to occupy. There were enough rooms that Sonny had space. There was enough money that the household ran smoothly. Mae hired help, managed the domestic staff with the same quiet efficiency her mother had applied to a much smaller household, and organized the rhythms of daily life around the presence and absence of a husband whose schedule was governed by imperatives she was not told and did not ask about. The neighborhood they moved into was middle class and mixed, not the kind of address that attracted attention, which was the point. Al had a specific and consistent philosophy about domestic life that he expressed in practical terms throughout this period. The house should be unremarkable. Mae should be comfortable. Sonny should want for nothing visible, and the family should present as solidly, boringly respectable. The violence and the money and the arrangements with police captains and judges were to remain on the other side of the front door, and the front door was to remain at all times a closed and ordinary-looking threshold. Mae's role in this arrangement was not passive exactly, but it was definitionally limited. She was not a participant in Al's business. She did not attend meetings, did not manage money beyond the household accounts, did not serve as a conduit for information or instruction. What she did was maintain the environment that made Al's other life possible. The clean house, the well-managed child, the social surface that allowed the family to exist in a neighborhood without becoming a subject of conversation. This maintenance was real work, even if it has rarely been described as such. What it required of her psychologically was a particular form of compartmentalization that went beyond ordinary marital discretion. Other wives in that neighborhood managed households while their husbands did things they didn't discuss at dinner. The difference in May's case was one of scale and of knowledge. The knowledge that the things not discussed at dinner included the management of city officials, the orchestration of violence, the deaths of men whose names occasionally appeared in the newspapers that arrived on her front step every morning. She read those newspapers. There's no reason to believe she did not. Sonny's medical situation during these early Chicago years continued to develop in the direction it had been heading since birth. His hearing loss was progressing. Mae took him to doctors, good ones, because the money was available, which was one of the things the money was genuinely useful for. The physicians she consulted in Chicago were better resourced than what Brooklyn had offered. The treatments were more sophisticated. None of them reversed what was happening, but they slowed it, managed it, gave Sonny tools for navigating a world he was hearing less and less of. Mae attended every appointment. She translated between the medical establishment and her son with a patience and consistency that the people who knew her in this period described as absolute. Al was present for some of these appointments and absent for others. His relationship with Sonny was genuinely warm. This is one of the details about Capone that surprises people who encounter it, but it is consistent across multiple sources. He was affectionate with his son, attentive to his condition in the way that a father can be attentive without being the one who manages the day-to-day weight of that condition. The weight was Mae's. The appointments were Mae's. The decisions about which surgeon, which treatment, which school that could accommodate a partially deaf child. These were Mae's, conducted within the larger framework of a household whose financial stability depended entirely on an enterprise she was not permitted to understand. The city itself was changing rapidly around them. By 1923, Torrio's operation had expanded to the point where the organizational chart of Chicago crime was something that journalists were beginning to map, imperfectly, but with increasing detail. The name Capone appeared in print for the first time in contexts that were not social announcements. Mae would have seen these appearances. The newspapers did not come into her house already edited. What she did with what she read is unrecorded. She did not leave. She did not, as far as any source suggests, confront Al with the content of what she was reading. She continued to manage the household, to take Sonny to his appointments, to attend Sunday Mass at a parish near the Prairie Avenue house, with the regularity that her Brooklyn upbringing had made non-negotiable. The house on South Prairie Avenue was well kept. The curtains were clean. The front step was swept. From the outside, it looked like exactly what Al needed it to look like. The home of a family that was doing well and minding its own business. Behind it, quietly and without drama, a woman was learning to live inside a structure she had not designed, could not exit, and was not allowed to name. There is a particular social performance that wives in Mae's position were required to give, and it was not the performance of happiness. Happiness was too legible, too easily scrutinized. The performance required was something more technically demanding, the performance of normalcy, not contentment, not joy, but the flat, unremarkable presentation of a household in which nothing extraordinary was occurring, a marriage in which the husband's activities were of the ordinary kind that husband's activities were supposed to be, a family that had money because families sometimes had money, and the sources of money were not, in polite company, a subject that required examination. Mae gave this performance every day. She gave it at the butcher, at the school, at Sunday Mass, at the parish social events she attended, with the consistency her Brooklyn upbringing had made structural. She gave it to the neighbors on South Prairie Avenue, who knew, at some level, that Al Capone was not a legitimate businessman, but who also knew that the Capone household was quiet and well-maintained, and that Mae was polite, and that Sonny was a sweet boy, and that these things counted for something in the daily arithmetic of neighborhood life. The performance had specific requirements. Dress was one of them. Mae's clothing throughout this period was carefully chosen, good quality, conservative cut, nothing that attracted attention or suggested ostentation. She wore the clothes of a respectable middle-class wife, rather than the clothes of a woman with access to serious money. This was not an accident. The visual vocabulary of respectability was something she had learned in Brooklyn and refined in Chicago, and it served a function beyond mere modesty. A woman who looked the part of ordinary wife was harder to approach with uncomfortable questions. She had built, through fabric and cut and color, a kind of social armor. Her social world in Chicago was narrow by design. The wives of Al's associates were available to her as companions. But this companionship was its own kind of isolation, relationships built on shared silence rather than shared disclosure, conversations that moved carefully around the subjects most present in everyone's lives. Mae did not form the kinds of intimate female friendships in Chicago that she had maintained, at least in attenuated form, in Brooklyn. The women she spent time with were bound to her by circumstance rather than affinity, and everyone understood this without saying so. The men who moved through her house were another matter entirely. Al's world required a degree of domestic hospitality, dinners, gatherings, the occasional overnight guest whose business with Al was not explained and not asked about. Mae hosted these events with the same competence she brought to everything domestic. The table was properly set, the food was good. She was present without being intrusive, attentive without being curious, warm in the specific register that made guests comfortable without inviting confidence. She had perfected the art of being in a room without being available for the kinds of conversations that rooms sometimes produced. This was not a small skill. It required constant calibration, knowing when to enter, when to withdraw, how to read the temperature of a conversation she was not part of, and respond to it with the correct degree of absence. There were men in her dining room whose names she would have recognized from newspapers. There were conversations, partially audible, that she would have been capable of understanding if she had chosen to understand them. The choosing not to understand was active, not passive. It required the same daily effort as any other form of maintenance. What the silence cost her is not something she left a record of, but its contours are visible in what surrounded it. By the mid-1920s, Al's operation had grown to the point where the Capone name was becoming nationally legible in ways that the Prairie Avenue house could not entirely absorb. The newspapers were more explicit. The public profile was harder to manage. Al moved the family in 1923 to a house on South Michigan Avenue, a step up in size and visibility that signaled the operation's expansion as clearly as any press report. Mae moved with him. She set up the new house with the same methodical competence. She found Sonny's new school. She located the nearest appropriate parish. She established new routines in new rooms and presented the same unremarkable exterior to a new set of neighbors. The moves would continue. Each house was larger than the last, better appointed, further from the compressed Brooklyn streets where the performance had first been calibrated. Each move required Mae to rebuild the surface from scratch. New neighbors to be read, new social geography to navigate, new versions of the same performance in new settings. The skill required for this was genuine and exhausting, and it went entirely unacknowledged because the point of the performance was that it looked effortless. Al, during these years, was accumulating enemies at the same rate he was accumulating territory. The Chicago outfit's expansion into new neighborhoods and new revenue streams brought it into conflict with the North Side Gang, led by Dion O'Banion and later by Jaime Weiss and George Moran. The violence between these factions was not abstract. It produced bodies, occasionally in public places, occasionally in ways that made the front page of newspapers that arrived on Mae's doorstep. Al survived multiple attempts on his life during this period, including a 1926 attack in Cicero, in which a convoy of cars opened fire on the Hawthorne Inn, while Capone associates dove for cover inside. Mae was not present at the Hawthorne Inn attack, but she knew about it. She knew about most of them in the way that a wife knows about things her husband does not tell her. Through the texture of his return home, through the phone calls that came at unusual hours, through the particular quality of the silences that followed certain kinds of news. She did not leave after the Hawthorne attack. She did not leave after any of the others. The question of why requires sitting with the specific architecture of her situation rather than reaching for easy answers. Leaving was not simply a matter of deciding to leave. It would have meant dismantling Sonny's medical care, his school, his routines. It would have meant returning somewhere. But Brooklyn was behind her, and the social logic of her community did not provide a framework for a wife who left a living husband. It would have meant becoming, in the language of her world, a woman who had failed to hold her marriage together, which was a failure that reflected entirely on the woman. The performance continued. The curtains stayed clean. The front step stayed swept. and Mae stayed, refining daily the particular discipline of a woman who had decided, at some level she may never have examined directly, that knowing and acting on knowing were two entirely different obligations, and that only one of them was required of her. The medical history of Al Capone has been documented with reasonable precision, largely because his deterioration became impossible to ignore by the time of his federal incarceration in the early 1930s. The prison physicians at Atlanta and later at Alcatraz were required to assess him, and their assessments went into records that eventually became available to researchers. What those records established was that Capone had been living with untreated syphilis for an estimated 15 to 20 years by the time he entered federal custody in 1932. The disease had progressed through its primary and secondary stages without intervention and had reached the tertiary phase, where it begins to attack the neurological system, producing the cognitive deterioration that would define the last decade of his life. 15 to 20 years back from 1932 places the original infection somewhere between 1912 and 1917. Al Capone was born in 1899. He was, by this calculation, infected with syphilis somewhere between the ages of 13 and 18. Mae Capone married him in December of 1918. Their son was born with congenital syphilis. These are the facts as the record establishes them. What they mean for Mae's body, her marriage, and her daily life across the following decades is a subject the historical record almost entirely avoids. Not because the information is unavailable, but because the questions it raises are ones that the dominant narrative of the Capone story has never found a comfortable way to hold. Syphilis in the early 20th century was not the manageable condition it would become after penicillin's widespread adoption in the 1940s. In 1918, the primary treatment was salvarsan, an arsenic-based compound that was partially effective against the early stages of the disease but required sustained administration and produced significant side effects. The treatment was also deeply stigmatized. Accessing it meant disclosing a diagnosis that carried with it associations of sexual transgression that the medical establishment and the broader culture treated as moral rather than purely medical facts. For a woman in Mae's social position, in her community, a syphilis diagnosis was not simply a health matter, it was a potential social annihilation. Whether Mae was formally diagnosed and treated, or whether she lived with the infection without ever receiving an explicit clinical account of what was happening in her body, is not something any surviving record clarifies. What the record does establish is that she remained in the marriage, that she continued to share a life and presumably a bed with Al Capone across the 1920s, and that the disease's progression through the family was never publicly acknowledged by anyone in the household. The silence around this was not incidental. It was load-bearing. The entire structure of the family's public presentation, the respectable wife, the Catholic household, the ordinary-looking home in a middle-class neighborhood, depended on a set of facts that included at its foundation a disease transmitted through sexual contact, contracted by a husband before the marriage, passed to a wife who could not speak of it, and expressed most visibly in the progressive hearing loss of a child who required constant medical attention. Sonny's deafness was the part of this that could not be entirely managed into invisibility. He existed, he was real, his condition was real, and the doctors who treated him across the 1920s would have had access, at least theoretically, to information about its origins. What they told Mae, what they told Al, what level of clinical frankness was applied to a family with the resources to ensure a degree of medical discretion? These are questions the record does not answer. What can be observed is Mae's behavior in relation to Sonny's medical care. She was, by every account, intensely involved. She attended every appointment. She researched surgical options. She managed his transition between medical providers with the organizational thoroughness she applied to everything within her domestic sphere. The care was genuine and sustained across decades, not the performed maternal attention of a woman managing appearances, but the detailed, exhausting daily engagement of a mother who understood that her child's condition required her permanent vigilance. Whether that vigilance was sharpened by guilt, by grief, by the particular knowledge of where Sonny's condition had originated, is not something Mae left any account of. But the intensity of her involvement in his medical care, set against the absolute silence she maintained about its underlying cause, suggests a woman carrying something that had no available outlet and no permissible language. Al's relationship to Sonny's deafness followed a different pattern. He was affectionate, generous with money for treatments, publicly warm in his expressions of paternal concern. He also, by all available evidence, never discussed the connection between his own medical history and his son's condition. Whether this was because he did not fully understand it, or because understanding it was incompatible with a self-image he needed to maintain, or because the conversation simply never happened in a household organized around the avoidance of certain conversations, the outcome was the same. Sonny moved through his childhood and adolescence within a family that loved him in visible, practical ways and could not speak about the most fundamental fact of his physical condition. The marriage bed itself, the physical reality of two people living as husband and wife in a household organized around the management of an unspoken medical reality, is a subject the historical literature treats as either irrelevant or inaccessible. It is neither. The question of what Mae's daily physical existence was like in a marriage to a man she knew, at some level, had infected her and her child is not a prurient one. It is the most intimate dimension of what the historical record is asking us to understand about her life. She did not leave the marriage after Sonny's diagnosis became clear. She did not leave it after Al's imprisonment, or after his neurological deterioration became impossible to manage privately. She stayed through all of it, and the staying was not passive. It was active, chosen, renewed daily against a set of circumstances that would have justified, by almost any external standard, a different decision. The Catholic framework she had been raised inside offered her a specific language for this staying. Duty, covenant, the marriage vow as something that did not contain exit clauses for the kinds of difficulties Mae was navigating. Whether she found that framework sustaining or whether it simply provided the vocabulary for a decision whose actual roots were more complicated is not something the record resolves. What the record shows is a woman who absorbed an enormous private damage and continued to function, continued to run the household, manage her son's care, attend mass, maintain appearances, with a composure that the people around her described consistently as strength, without examining very carefully what the strength was being used to hold in place. Albert Francis Capone, Sonny, started school in Chicago in the mid-1920s in circumstances that required careful management from the beginning. His hearing loss had progressed to the point where ordinary classroom instruction was difficult, and the educational options available to a partially deaf child in that era were limited in ways that money could partially but not entirely address. Mae researched the options with the thoroughness she brought to all of Sonny's medical decisions, and eventually placed him in schools that could provide some accommodation, smaller classrooms, teachers willing to work with his condition, environments where his disability would not simply leave him sitting in the back of a room watching mouths move without comprehension. The logistics of this were Mae's to manage entirely. Al contributed money and occasional expressions of paternal concern, but the daily work of finding the right school, communicating with teachers, monitoring Sonny's progress, and adjusting the arrangements when they stopped working. This was Mae's domain in the same total way that everything involving the household's interior functioning was Mae's domain. What made Sonny's school situation specifically complicated was not his hearing loss alone, but his name. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone was becoming a figure of national notoriety. The newspapers had moved past vague references to organized crime and were beginning to produce detailed, named accounts of Chicago's criminal landscape that placed Capone near its center. Sonny arrived at school each day carrying a name that other children had heard their parents discuss at dinner tables, in ways that children absorb without fully understanding but that translate with perfect accuracy into the social dynamics of schoolyards and classrooms. He was teased. He was isolated. He was, in the specific social economy of childhood, the son of a man whose name was famous for the wrong reasons, and the other children in his schools processed this in the way that children process the social information they receive from adults, clumsily, cruelly, with the particular inventiveness that children bring to the task of excluding those who make them feel uncertain. Mae responded to this the way she responded to most problems involving Sonny, with practical intervention. She moved him between schools when the situation became untenable. She communicated with teachers and administrators, presenting herself as a concerned mother whose son had a hearing disability and needed additional support, without engaging directly with the other dimension of the problem. She could not walk into a school office and say that her son was being tormented because of his father's occupation. She could address the hearing loss. The name was untouchable. The pattern this established, Sonny, as the visible bearer of costs that could not be named, continued across his childhood and into his adolescence. He underwent multiple surgical procedures on his ears during these years. The surgeries were conducted by good physicians, funded without difficulty, and produced results that were partial and inconsistent. Some restored modest amounts of hearing for limited periods. Others did not. Mae accompanied him to every procedure, sat in waiting rooms while surgeons worked, managed his recovery at home with the same attentive care she had brought to his medical situation since infancy. What the surgeries could not address was the social architecture being built around him. By the late 1920s, Sonny was a teenager whose father's name appeared in newspaper headlines with a regularity that made ordinary adolescence essentially impossible. He could not move through Chicago, or anywhere in the country, as an anonymous young man. The name followed him with the persistence of something he had not chosen and could not shed, and the hearing loss that was itself a product of what the name represented added a layer of physical difficulty to the social one. Mae's awareness of this double bind was acute. She had built her entire adult life around the management of the Capone name's public dimensions, around the maintenance of a domestic normalcy that could coexist with what the name meant in the world outside the front door. With Sonny, this management had a different quality. Not the cold, technical performance she gave for neighbors and social acquaintances, but something rawer, driven by a grief she could not express because expressing it would require naming its cause. There is one specific episode from this period that illustrates the texture of Sonny's situation with particular clarity. In 1929, following the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which placed Al Capone's name at the center of the most widely covered gangland killing in American history, Sonny was enrolled at a school in Miami, where the family had recently established a second residence at their Palm Island estate. The massacre had made the Capone name functionally radioactive in public life. Mae had moved Sonny to Florida partly to remove him from Chicago's increasingly hostile social environment. The Miami school presented the same problem as the Chicago schools, compressed into a new geography. Other students knew the name. Teachers knew the name. The administration of the school knew the name and faced its own institutional discomfort about the presence of Al Capone's son in their classrooms. Sonny navigated this with the particular stoicism of a young person who has learned that the circumstances of his life are not negotiable and that the available responses are limited to endurance. Mae managed the Miami school situation the way she had managed the Chicago ones, through practical intervention, careful communication, the presentation of herself as a respectable mother, whose son's needs were legitimate and whose family's business was not a subject for the school's concern. She was polite and firm in the way she had always been polite and firm. And it worked, to the extent that it worked, because Mae Capone was a woman who made it very difficult for institutional authority to find a comfortable way to refuse her. But the management was always temporary. The name did not go away. The hearing loss did not go away. Sonny grew up at the intersection of these two immovable facts: a body compromised by his father's history and a social identity defined by it. And Mae's response to both was the same sustained, exhausting, practical attention that characterized everything she did for him. What it produced in Sonny was not the smooth, protected childhood Mae's efforts were aimed at creating. It produced a young man who was quiet in the way that people become quiet when they have learned that being heard is complicated, who moved carefully through social situations with the particular alertness of someone who has been surprised before by how quickly ordinary moments can turn. He loved his mother. The record on this is consistent. He was devoted to her across his entire life in a way that suggests he understood, at some level that probably never became fully articulate, what her efforts on his behalf had cost. What it cost her: the years of surgical waiting rooms, the school conversations conducted without the ability to say the true thing, the daily management of a child's suffering whose origin she carried in her own body and could not speak, is not something Mae recorded. The record holds only the outcomes: a son who survived, who functioned, who remained close to her until she died. The price of that outcome was paid somewhere Mae did not leave a map to. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 men were shot dead in a garage on North Clark Street in Chicago. The victims were members of the North Side Gang, gathered ostensibly to receive a delivery of hijacked whiskey. What they received instead was a coordinated attack by men dressed as police officers, who lined them against the wall and fired until the garage was silent. The killing took less than 2 minutes. The cleanup took considerably longer, in ways that extended across months and years and eventually reached into every corner of the Capone household. Al Capone was in Florida when it happened. This alibi was real, documented, and entirely deliberate. The planning had been careful enough to ensure that the man whose operation benefited most from the deaths of George Moran's senior associates would have an unimpeachable account of his whereabouts. Mae was also in Florida. She was at the Palm Island house, which Al had purchased the previous year, and which represented a significant expansion of the family's domestic infrastructure. A 14-room Mediterranean revival property on a private island in Biscayne Bay, with a swimming pool, a boat dock, and the kind of physical separation from neighbors that the Prairie Avenue house had never provided. The news of the massacre reached them in Florida through the same channels it reached everyone else: the newspapers, the radio, the telephone calls that began arriving almost immediately from people whose business gave them particular reasons to be concerned about what had happened in that garage on North Clark Street. Mae received this news in a house she was still learning to inhabit, in a city that was not Chicago, surrounded by the particular quiet of a property designed to keep the outside world at a distance. What she said or did in the hours and days immediately following the massacre is not recorded. What is recorded is what she did in public in the weeks that followed, and the contrast between the scale of the event and the absolute stillness of her public presentation is one of the most striking features of her behavior during this period. She appeared in Miami society in the days after the massacre with the same composed, unremarkable presentation she had maintained through every previous escalation of Al's public profile. She attended church. She was seen shopping. She accompanied Al to a dinner at a Miami restaurant roughly a week after the killings, dressed appropriately, presenting the flat, functional social surface that had become her primary public instrument. The newspapers that covered Al's Florida activities in this period noted her presence in the same terms they always used, as a quiet, well-dressed woman beside a famous man, generating no story of her own. This was the performance at its most technically demanding. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had shifted something in the national perception of Al Capone, had moved him from notorious Chicago figure to something more broadly and darkly legible, a name associated not just with bootlegging and corruption, but with a specific documented act of mass violence that the country found impossible to look away from. The pressure on everyone adjacent to that name intensified accordingly. Journalists became more aggressive. Law enforcement attention, which had been significant before, increased in ways that were visible and deliberate. The social environment around the Capone family tightened. Mae's response to this tightening was to become more still, not withdrawn. Withdrawal would have been legible, would have suggested awareness of something that required withdrawal. Instead, she became more precisely, more consistently present in the ordinary registers of her life, more regular at Mass, more visible in the domestic routines that anchored the household to the appearance of normalcy. The performance did not escalate into something theatrical. It compressed into something smaller and harder and more perfectly controlled. Al's response to the increased pressure was characteristically different. He moved toward visibility rather than away from it, giving interviews, appearing at public events, cultivating a press persona that leaned into notoriety rather than deflecting it. The contrast between husband and wife in this period was absolute. He expanded. She contracted. He gave the newspapers a story to write. She gave them nothing. This asymmetry was not accidental. It was, in its way, a division of labor. Al's public flamboyance drew attention toward a version of himself he could manage: the generous gangster, the neighborhood benefactor, the man who kept the beer flowing during Prohibition. Mae's absolute stillness drew attention away from the household's interior, away from the questions about what a wife in her position knew and when she had known it, away from the specific and complicated reality of their domestic life. The Palm Island house became, in the aftermath of the massacre, the primary stage for this performance. It was large enough to suggest prosperity without being so ostentatious as to invite purely hostile scrutiny, though the scrutiny came anyway from journalists who staked it out, from neighbors who resented the Capone's presence on the island, from the Miami City Commission, which would later attempt to formally remove the family from the community through a series of legal maneuvers that ultimately failed, but that made clear the family was not welcome. Mae managed the Palm Island household through this period with the same organizational competence she had brought to every previous domestic setting. She supervised the staff, maintained the property, ensured that Al's specific domestic requirements, and he had many. He was, by all accounts, particular about food, about comfort, about the specific texture of his home environment, were met without friction. She was the mechanism by which the house functioned, and the house's functioning was not a trivial matter. It served as Al's primary refuge from the increasing chaos of his public life, and a refuge requires maintenance. Sonny was at the Palm Island house during parts of this period, navigating a Miami adolescence that the massacre had made considerably more complicated. Mae managed his school situation in Miami with the same careful competence she had brought to it in Chicago, now operating within a social environment that had been freshly reminded, in the most violent possible terms, of what the Capone name meant. She was 40 years old. No, she was 30 years old in 1929. Though photographs from this period show a woman whose composure reads as older than her age in the specific way that sustained performance ages a face, not visibly worn, but settled into a kind of permanent, careful stillness that is different from rest. The massacre did not break anything visible in Mae Capone's life. It did not produce a crisis that the record catches. It produced instead a slight intensification of everything that was already there. The stillness a degree stiller, the performance a degree more precise, the household a degree more carefully managed. The country was watching Al Capone. Mae Capone gave it nothing to see. The federal government's case against Al Capone did not come from the direction anyone in the household had been watching. By 1930, the Justice Department had concluded that prosecuting Capone for the crimes most visibly associated with his name, the violence, the bootlegging, the corruption of city officials, was logistically and legally prohibitive. The witnesses were unavailable in the specific way that witnesses in organized crime cases become unavailable, and the evidentiary chains that would have been required to connect Capone directly to specific acts were either broken or had never existed in prosecutable form. What the government found instead was money, or more precisely, what it found was the absence of a paper trail around money that had very obviously existed and moved in enormous quantities across a decade. The tax evasion case that federal prosecutors assembled against Capone between 1930 and 1931 was built on the straightforward premise that he had received millions of dollars in income over several years and had paid no taxes on any of it. This was not a complicated legal theory. It was, in its way, an almost mundane accusation. The same charge that might be leveled against a contractor or a merchant, stripped of the violence and the organizational apparatus, and reduced to its financial skeleton. Al Capone was indicted in June of 1931 on 22 counts of tax evasion. The trial began in October of the same year. Mae attended. Her presence at the trial was deliberate and managed with the same care she brought to every public appearance. She dressed conservatively. Dark colors, simple lines, the visual vocabulary of a respectable wife rather than the companion of a criminal defendant. She sat in the courtroom with composure that the journalists covering the trial noted repeatedly, not because it was remarkable in itself, but because the context made it conspicuous. The trial was a national spectacle. The press coverage was intense and often lurid. The courtroom was full of people performing something, and Mae's performance, of steadiness, of loyalty, of a wife present because presence was what wives did, was the most controlled and least legible of all of them. She was not there every day. The trial lasted approximately 2 weeks, and Mae's attendance was selective in a way that suggested management rather than impulse, present on the days when the visual of a devoted wife was most useful, present when the jury was being selected and first impressions were forming, present when closing arguments made the courtroom feel like a stage on which every audience member was also a performer. On the days when the technical accounting testimony that formed the spine of the prosecution's case made the proceedings dry and procedural, she was sometimes absent. Whether her attendance was coordinated with Al's legal team or whether it arose from her own reading of the situation is not established in the record. What is established is that Mae Capone understood by 1931 the visual grammar of public loyalty, and that she deployed it with a precision that suggests long practice. She had been performing versions of this for a decade: the composed wife at church, the unremarkable presence at social events, the woman who stood beside a famous and dangerous man and gave the watching world nothing to attach to. The courthouse was a more formal theater with better lighting and more explicit stakes, but the performance itself was not new. Al's behavior during the trial was, by contrast, notably less controlled. He had entered the proceedings with what appears to have been a genuine belief, encouraged by his lawyers and by the experience of having avoided prosecution for so long, that some arrangement would materialize before a verdict was required. He had spent years navigating a city in which money and connection could redirect almost any institutional process, and the federal courtroom in Chicago seemed initially like another institutional process susceptible to the same management. The jury tampering that his associates attempted during the trial's early stages resulted in the entire jury panel being replaced, which was the moment at which the proceedings took on a quality that could no longer be managed from the inside. The verdict came on October 17, 1931. Guilty on 5 of the 22 counts. The sentence was 11 years in federal prison, plus fines and court costs. Al Capone heard it in a courtroom full of journalists who had their copy written before the judge finished speaking. Mae heard it beside him. What her face showed at that moment is described differently in different accounts. Some reporters noted that she remained expressionless, others that she briefly reached for Al's arm, others that she was already composing herself for the photographs that would be taken on the courthouse steps. The differences in these accounts probably reflect the differences in where the journalists were standing and what they were primed to see, rather than any inconsistency in Mae's actual behavior. She was not a woman who came apart in public. The circumstances of her adult life had not permitted that, and by 1931, the habit of composure was probably indistinguishable from the instinct. Outside the courthouse, photographs were taken. Mae appears in several of them. Beside Al, slightly behind him, in the dark conservative clothing she had selected for the occasion. Her expression in these photographs has the quality that her expressions in photographs always had: present, controlled, unreadable in the specific way that signals not the absence of interior life, but its deliberate management. The weeks between the verdict and Al's transfer to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta were, in practical terms, a period of intense domestic reorganization. The household that had been running on the assumption of Al's continued presence needed to be reconfigured around his absence. Finances restructured, staff arrangements revised, the Palm Island house placed in a kind of suspended maintenance. Mae managed all of this with the organizational competence that had characterized her domestic role throughout the marriage. She also managed Sonny, who was 13 at the time of his father's conviction, and who was navigating the specific cruelty of being an adolescent with a famous name when that name was generating its most concentrated national coverage. Mae moved him through this period with the same practical attention she had always given him. Managing his school situation, managing his medical needs, maintaining in the domestic environment a degree of routine that the external circumstances were working constantly to disrupt. Al was transferred to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in May of 1932. Mae drove him to the station. She stood on the platform in the dark conservative clothing. She did not cry in public, or if she did, no reporter recorded it. The train left. Mae returned to a house that had always been hers to run, and now was hers in a different and more total sense. No husband whose domestic requirements organized the household's rhythms. No presence around which the performance of normalcy had been structured. What remained was the performance itself, now running without its primary audience. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was not where Al Capone was supposed to stay. Within months of his arrival in 1932, reports began circulating that he had established a degree of comfort inside the institution that the federal government found embarrassing, that money and influence had followed him through the prison gates in attenuated but still functional form, that his cell was better appointed than others, that his access to certain privileges exceeded what the regulations technically permitted. Whether these reports were entirely accurate, or whether they were partly the product of a press corps that found the story of Capone domesticating a federal prison irresistible, their effect was real. In 1934, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Al Capone to a facility specifically designed to make the kind of management he had practiced in Atlanta impossible. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sat on an island in San Francisco Bay, accessible only by boat, designed from its inception as a place where the institutional apparatus could not be worked from the inside. The isolation was the point. Prisoners could not be reached by the networks they had maintained on the outside. Visitors were limited in frequency and duration. Mail was monitored. The mechanisms through which a man like Al Capone had always operated. The personal relationships, the financial arrangements, the cultivation of individual loyalty through individual benefit, were structurally foreclosed. Mae visited when the regulations permitted. The visits were infrequent by the standards of the marriage's previous rhythms, not daily, not weekly, not even monthly, in any consistent pattern. The journey from Miami to San Francisco was long and expensive and logistically complex in ways that the 1930s made more demanding than they would later become. She made it nonetheless, traveling across the country to sit in a visiting room on an island in the bay and conduct a conversation with her husband through whatever medium the institution provided. Sometimes a glass partition, sometimes a monitored table, always a guard within hearing distance, always a fixed and insufficient amount of time. What they talked about is not recorded. The monitoring of conversations during Alcatraz visits was real but imperfect, and whatever documentation existed has not survived in accessible form. What can be inferred from the visit logs and from the letters that passed between them, also monitored, also partially preserved, is that Mae maintained the connection with a consistency that required significant personal effort. She wrote regularly. She reported on Sonny's activities and progress. She managed the practical matters of the household's finances and maintenance and communicated their status in terms that were careful and somewhat coded, aware that the correspondence was not private. The letters Mae received back from Al during the Alcatraz years have been described by researchers who have seen portions of them as affectionate and increasingly disoriented. The syphilis that had been silently progressing for 2 decades was by the mid-1930s beginning to affect his cognition in ways that the prison's medical staff documented with clinical detachment. He complained of headaches. His memory became inconsistent. His letters, which had never been particularly literate, Al Capone was not a man whose education had extended very far into written expression, became harder to follow, the syntax more erratic, the references sometimes unclear. Mae read these letters in the Palm Island house, or in the apartment she maintained in Miami for periods when the island property felt too large and too isolated. She read them and responded to them and filed them away with the same methodical care she brought to every piece of paper that passed through her domestic administration. The deterioration they documented was gradual enough in its early stages that each individual letter could be read without confronting the full trajectory. The trajectory became visible only in aggregate across the months and years of correspondence, and Mae was accumulating that aggregate in real time. Sonny was in his late teens during the Alcatraz years, and his situation had stabilized into something that functioned, if not easily. He had completed his schooling with the accommodations Mae had spent years arranging, had developed the capacity to navigate his hearing loss with the tools available to him, and had reached an age at which the worst of the childhood social cruelty had at least changed form. He was not unaffected by his father's imprisonment. The Capone name in the mid-1930s was still nationally prominent, still generating press coverage, still the first thing anyone learned about him in any new social context. But he was managing it with an adult composure that was recognizably his mother's, applied to circumstances that were recognizably his father's legacy. Mae's daily life during the Alcatraz years had a quality that several people who knew her in this period described, in later accounts, as suspended. The Palm Island house was maintained, the staff was paid, the routines continued, church, domestic management, correspondence, the occasional social appearance required to prevent the complete withdrawal that would itself have attracted comment. But the organizing principle of the household, the management of Al's domestic environment and public presentation, was temporarily gone replaced by the management of his absence, which required a different and in some ways more demanding set of skills. The Depression had changed the texture of the world outside the Palm Island gates in ways that made the household's continued prosperity conspicuous in a new register. The country was poor in the early and mid-1930s in a way that was visible and painful, and the Capone household was not poor. The money that maintained the estate, paid the staff, funded Sonny's ongoing medical needs, and covered the cost of Mae's cross-country trips to San Francisco was the accumulated product of an enterprise whose human costs were distributed across Chicago's neighborhoods in ways that the prosperity of the Palm Island house did not reflect and could not absorb. Mae moved through this period in the same clothes she had always worn. Conservative, good quality, unremarkable. She attended the same church with the same regularity. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. When journalists approached her, and they did periodically drawn by the ongoing national fascination with the Capone name, she declined with the same polite, impenetrable composure she had maintained since Brooklyn. The waiting was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as suffering. It looked from the outside like a woman managing a household and corresponding with her incarcerated husband and attending to her son's needs and going to church on Sundays. From the inside, it was the accumulation of years in which the life Mae had built, the performance of normalcy, the maintenance of appearances, the sustained management of the gap between what existed and what was discussed, continued to run without the presence of the man whose requirements had originally organized it. The machinery kept moving. Mae kept it moving. Al, on his island in the Bay, was becoming someone she had not yet fully encountered. Al Capone was released from federal custody on November 16, 1939. He had served 7.5 years, transferred from Alcatraz to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California in 1938, as his medical condition made the rigors of Alcatraz increasingly difficult to justify on institutional grounds. The prison doctors at Terminal Island had assessed him with a frankness that the earlier records had approached more cautiously. Their diagnosis was neurosyphilis, tertiary stage, with documented cognitive impairment that they described in terms suggesting a man whose mental functioning had regressed significantly from what it had been at the time of his conviction. He was 40 years old when he walked out of Terminal Island. He had the cognitive profile, by the medical assessment of the period, of someone considerably older and considerably more damaged. Mae was there. She had traveled to California for the release, and the photographs taken that day show her beside Al on the steps of the facility, composed, conservatively dressed, her hand near his arm in a gesture that reads as steadying without being obviously so. Al looks heavier than his prison intake photographs, softer in the face, his expression carrying the particular blankness that neurosyphilis produces when it has progressed far enough to affect the affect itself. He was smiling in some of the photographs, but the smile does not reach his eyes in the way it did in earlier images. Something behind it had changed or dimmed or ceased to be available to him in the way it once had been. They traveled together to Palm Island. Mae had spent the weeks before his release preparing the house for a situation that was categorically different from any domestic arrangement she had previously managed. Al was not returning as the man who had left, the active, demanding, organizationally engaged presence whose domestic requirements she had spent 2 decades calibrating herself to meet. He was returning as someone who needed management of a different and more intimate kind, someone whose daily functioning required supervision, whose moods were less predictable than they had been, whose relationship to reality was intermittently unreliable in the specific ways that neurological deterioration produces. The medical care he required was immediate and ongoing. Mae arranged for physicians to attend him at the Palm Island house, established a routine of treatment and monitoring that she administered with the same thoroughness she had brought to Sonny's medical management across the previous 2 decades. The parallel between the two situations: a son whose congenital condition had required her sustained medical attention throughout his childhood, a husband whose own disease had now produced its own debilitating effects, was not something Mae is recorded as having remarked upon, but it was the organizing reality of the Palm Island household. In the years following Al's release, the world Al had operated in did not wait for him. This was perhaps the single fact about his release that most clearly distinguished it from the fantasy of return that prison probably sustains. The Chicago outfit had reorganized during his incarceration in ways that did not require his return and did not particularly welcome it. Frank Nitti, who had managed operations in Al's absence, had no structural reason to defer to a man whose neurological condition made him an organizational liability rather than an asset. The associates who had been loyal to Al personally, loyal in the specific instrumental way that loyalty operates in criminal organizations, had redistributed their loyalties in the 7 years he had been gone. A few came to Palm Island to pay their respects in the months following his release. Most did not. Al seemed, in the accounts of people who visited the house in the early 1940s, not always to fully understand this. There were days when he spoke about Chicago operations as though he expected to return to them, as though the organizational world he had left in 1932 was waiting in the same configuration for his reinsertion. Mae managed these conversations with visitors, with family members who came to Palm Island and found him disorienting. With the same composed deflection she had applied to every other category of difficult truth in her married life. She did not contradict him in front of others. She did not confirm the fantasy either. She moved the conversation, changed the subject, redirected with a practiced fluency that served as both social protection for Al's dignity and practical management of what could have otherwise become uncomfortable confrontations with his condition. Sonny was married by this point. He had wed Diana Ruth Casey in 1941, and the marriage had produced grandchildren who came to Palm Island for visits. Al was genuinely delighted by the grandchildren on his better days, engaged and warm in the way he had always been with Sonny, the affectionate paternal register surviving in functional form, even as other cognitive capacities deteriorated. These visits gave the Palm Island household, on certain days, something that resembled ordinary family life. Grandchildren in the pool, Al in a chair by the water, Mae managing the domestic details of a household that had expanded temporarily around a family gathering. Between those visits, the household contracted back to its baseline. Mae, Al, the medical staff, and the particular silence of a property maintained at significant expense in the service of a life that had lost most of its outward organizing purpose. Al's health declined in measurable increments across the early 1940s. The neurological deterioration was not linear. There were periods of relative clarity followed by periods of confusion, a pattern that made the overall trajectory difficult to confront directly because on the good days, it was possible to believe the good days were the norm. Mae knew better. She had been managing his condition closely enough and long enough to understand that the clarity was intermittent and that the general direction was fixed. She managed the medical side of this knowledge with her characteristic thoroughness. What she did with the rest of it is not something the record holds. The war years gave the outside world other things to attend to, and the Capone household receded from national attention in a way that was probably the closest Mae had come to the ordinary obscurity she had never quite been permitted. The name still carried its weight. It always would. But Al's incapacity meant there was no new news to generate, no fresh incident to pull the cameras back to the Palm Island gate. Mae cooked for him. She sat with him in the evenings. She managed his medications with the precision she had always brought to medical management, ensured he ate properly, monitored the symptoms the doctors had told her to watch for. She attended to him in the intimate, daily, unglamorous ways that serious illness requires, in a house that was large and well-appointed and absolutely quiet in the way that houses become quiet when most of what organized them has already passed. The man who had filled the household, weighed with his requirements, his associates, his energy, the constant ambient pressure of his presence, was physically there. Something essential was not. Mae attended to what was there. She had always attended to what was there. The Palm Island estate sat behind a wall. This was not unusual for properties of its size and value in Miami Beach, but the wall around the Capone house had a specific history. It had been raised incrementally over the years in response to specific threats, specific incidents, the accumulated experience of living in a property that attracted unwanted attention in multiple registers simultaneously. Journalists had photographed it from boats in the bay. Curious tourists had driven slowly past the gate. Law enforcement had surveilled it during the years of Al's operation. The wall was not merely architectural. It was the physical expression of a household that had spent 2 decades managing its boundary with the outside world. By the early 1940s, the wall enclosed a life that had shrunk to fit the property. The visitors had stopped coming with any regularity. The associates who had once moved through the house, the men whose conversations stopped when Mae entered rooms, whose presence had required the specific domestic hospitality she had provided throughout the Chicago years, were gone. What remained was a household staff, a deteriorating husband, a woman who had organized her entire adult life around the management of an exterior presentation, and now had almost no exterior to present to. The estate itself was significant. The house had 14 rooms, a pool that Al had installed in the late 1920s, one of the first private pools in Miami Beach, a boat dock, palm trees along the perimeter, a view of the bay that was genuinely beautiful in the way that expensive waterfront properties are beautiful. Mae maintained all of it with the same organizational thoroughness she had always brought to domestic management. The grounds were kept. The house was clean. The staff was paid and managed with the quiet efficiency that had always characterized her household administration. But the maintenance was no longer in service of anything beyond itself. The house had been designed, functionally, if not consciously, as a refuge and a stage simultaneously, a place where Al could retreat from the pressure of his public life and where the family could present a version of domestic normality legible enough to manage their social position. Both functions had lapsed. Al's public life had ended. The social position that required management through domestic performance had resolved into something simpler and grimmer. The Capones were no longer navigating a complicated public reputation. They were simply unwelcome. The city of Miami Beach had made this explicit. Through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, various civic bodies and neighborhood organizations had made formal and informal attempts to pressure the Capones into selling the property and leaving. The methods were not always legally coherent, but they were persistent. Ordinances proposed, petitions circulated, social pressure applied through the specific channels available to a community that wanted someone gone but lacked the legal mechanism to compel their departure. Mae's response to this campaign was the same as her response to every previous form of external pressure. She did not move. This was not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. It was the expression of a woman who had nowhere else to go that would be meaningfully different. The Capone name followed the property. Moving the property did not move the name, and the Palm Island house had one practical advantage that could not be replicated elsewhere. It was paid for, fully and outright, in a way that provided a form of security that Mae had learned, across decades of living on money with no visible source, to treat as the only reliable kind. The neighborhood's hostility expressed itself in the texture of daily life in ways that were small but cumulative. Invitations were not extended. Social reciprocity was not offered. The ordinary fabric of community life, the casual exchanges, the neighborhood relationships, the sense of being part of a social world, was withheld in the deliberate, deniable way that social exclusion operates at its most refined. Mae went to church. She shopped. She moved through the community with the same composed, unremarkable presentation she had always maintained. The community declined to meet her in it. Al's condition continued to deteriorate through 1945 and into 1946. The pattern of relative clarity interspersed with confusion that had characterized the early years of his return had shifted. The periods of clarity became shorter and less frequent, the confusion more persistent and more pronounced. He required more direct physical care as his neurological condition progressed, and Mae provided it or supervised its provision with the same intimate thoroughness she had brought to his management since his release. She bathed him. She fed him when he could not manage it himself. She sat with him through the nights when his sleep was disrupted by the symptoms his condition produced. The physical intimacy of this caregiving had a quality that is worth considering against the full history of the marriage. This was a man who had infected her with a disease she had lived with for decades without public acknowledgement. This was a man whose occupation had organized her life around the management of violence and its consequences, had made her son's childhood a sustained exercise in navigating shame, had left her isolated in a walled property on an island that the surrounding community was actively trying to expel her from. She cared for him anyway, not with the performed devotion of a woman managing appearances, because there was no audience left for that performance, but with the practical, daily, physical attention that his condition required, and that she provided, because she was there, and he needed it. What this says about Mae Capone is not something that resolves into a simple formulation. It is not evidence of a love story. It is not evidence of a transaction completed. It is evidence of a woman whose understanding of obligation had been formed in a specific community, at a specific time, around specific values, and whose capacity to act against that understanding, even in circumstances that might have justified it by almost any external measure, had never developed into something she could use. Sonny visited when he could, bringing his family, filling the house temporarily with the noise of grandchildren and the ordinary rhythms of family life. These visits were the closest the Palm Island household came, in its final years, to resembling the thing it had always been presented as: an ordinary family home, a place where people gathered and ate and talked and were comfortable. Between visits, the quiet settled back over the property, like something physical. Mae moved through the rooms. She checked the medications. She spoke to the doctors when they came. She managed the staff. She sat in the evenings by the water that was genuinely beautiful and that she had not chosen and could not leave. The wall held. Everything it was meant to hold out was already elsewhere. What it held in was harder to name. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947. He was 48 years old. The immediate cause was cardiac arrest, preceded by a stroke he had suffered several days earlier that left him unconscious and unresponsive in the Palm Island house, while Mae and the medical staff managed what the physicians had already communicated was a terminal decline. The stroke came on January 21st. He did not recover from it in any meaningful sense. He died 4 days later, in the house, with Mae present. The death was not unexpected. Mae had been managing the trajectory of his neurological deterioration for years, with the same clinical attentiveness she brought to all medical matters within her domestic sphere, and the physicians attending him had made the probable endpoint clear enough that she had been living in its proximity for some time before it arrived. The stroke was the formalization of something already underway rather than a sudden rupture in the household's functioning. What the death formalized in practical terms was a set of legal and financial circumstances that required immediate navigation. Al Capone's estate, at the time of his death, was considerably less than the mythology of his wealth suggested. The federal government had pursued back taxes, fines, and court costs across the years since his conviction, with the persistence of an institution that had scored a significant legal victory and intended to extract its full value. The money that had moved through the Capone operation at its peak, in Boicras, estimates varied but consistently ran into the tens of millions of dollars annually, had not been preserved in forms that survived federal scrutiny intact. What remained was real but bounded: the Palm Island property, some furniture and personal effects, financial accounts that had been managed carefully enough through the lean years to provide ongoing maintenance of the household, but not the limitless resource that the public imagination had always associated with the Capone name. Mae was 47 years old when Al died. She had been his wife for 28 years. She had, in that time, managed 2 major households across 2 cities, supervised the medical care of both her husband and her son through conditions that required sustained and expert attention, maintained a public presentation of domestic normalcy through a decade of nationally covered criminal proceedings, and provided intensive personal care to a neurologically deteriorating man for the last 7 years of his life. None of this had a market value, and none of it was legible in the estate documents that her attorneys began working through in the days following Al's death. The funeral arrangements fell to Mae, as everything organizational had always fallen to Mae. Al was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, a return to the city that had made him and unmade him, conducted with the privacy that Mae enforced over every aspect of the family's dealings with the press. The burial was attended by family and a small number of people from Al's past. It was not a public event in any sense that Mae could prevent it from being, but she prevented what she could, controlling the access and the information with the same competence she had always brought to the management of the family's public exposure. The press covered it anyway. The death of Al Capone was a national news event of the kind that generates its own momentum regardless of the family's preferences, and the coverage was extensive and retrospective. Long assessments of his career, photographs from the Chicago years, the familiar narrative of rise and fall that the culture had already assembled around his name and needed only to append a final paragraph to. Mae appeared in some of this coverage as a minor figure, the loyal wife, a sentence or two, her presence at the funeral noted without examination. What the coverage did not examine, because it had never examined it, was what the preceding 28 years had looked like from inside the household rather than outside it. The narrative of Al Capone that the culture had constructed across those decades was a narrative about Al Capone, his ambition, his violence, his flamboyance, his fall. Mae existed in this narrative only as a peripheral indicator of his domestic life, evidence that he had a home and a family, proof that the monster had a human surround. That she might have a story of her own, with its own costs and its own weight, was not a question the coverage asked. She returned to Palm Island after the funeral. The house was hers now, in the most complete sense. No husband whose condition organized the daily routine, no caretaking responsibilities structuring the hours, no external pressure that required the specific kind of management she had spent her adult life providing. The staff remained. The grounds remained. The wall remained. Sonny was 28 at the time of his father's death, a married man with children of his own, living a life that had managed to establish some modest distance from the Capone name through sheer ordinariness. He visited Palm Island. He was attentive to Mae in the way he had always been attentive to her, with a devotion that ran in the specific direction of a child who understood, without having a complete account of why he understood it, that his mother had absorbed something on his behalf. The estate's practical management settled into a pattern that would persist for years. The Palm Island property required ongoing maintenance that was expensive and that the estate's resources could sustain, but not indefinitely, and not without careful administration. Mae administered it carefully, as she administered everything. The money was managed with the same quiet competence she had always brought to the household accounts. Nothing wasted, nothing displayed, the minimum necessary spent on maintenance, and the rest preserved against a future whose shape was not yet clear. She was 47, with no occupation, no public identity beyond the name she had acquired at 20, no community that claimed her, no social world that included her, and no framework for what the next portion of her life was supposed to contain. The neighborhood beyond the wall continued its polite, persistent campaign of exclusion. The church continued to provide the Sunday structure that had organized her weeks since childhood. Sonny continued to visit. The grandchildren came in the summers and made the pool useful. Between these fixed points, Mae Capone lived inside a house that the world associated entirely with a man who was no longer in it, in a city that did not want her, on an island that the bay surrounded on all sides, behind a wall that had been built incrementally against threats that had mostly already arrived and already passed. The house was well kept. The curtains were clean. She had nowhere that was more hers than this, and nowhere that was less. Mae Capone lived for 39 years after Al died. This is a number that sits oddly against the historical record, which tends to treat her story as ending with his, as though the function she served in the Capone narrative concluded when the narrative's central figure was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, and the remaining decades were simply a prolonged administrative aftermath. She was 47 in 1947. She would not die until April 16, 1986. The years between those two dates constitute more than half of her adult life, and they are almost entirely absent from the historical literature. What fills those years, from the outside, is silence. She gave no interviews across nearly 4 decades during which the appetite for anything Capone-related remained commercially and culturally significant. Publishers approached her. Journalists wrote to her. People who were assembling accounts of the Chicago outfit's history made attempts to reach her through intermediaries, through family members, through lawyers. She declined everything with a consistency so absolute that it eventually stopped being remarkable and became simply a known fact about her. Mae Capone did not talk. The silence was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. The silence was the continuation, across 4 decades of widowhood, of the discipline she had developed in Brooklyn at 19 and refined across every subsequent circumstance her life had produced. She had never talked. The difference now was that talking was available to her in a way it had not been before. Al was dead. The legal jeopardy that attached to the household was resolved. There was no ongoing enterprise whose exposure she was protecting. She could, in practical terms, have spoken. She chose not to. The Palm Island estate remained hers through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, maintained with the careful economy she had always applied to the household finances. The property's upkeep was expensive, and the estate's resources, while real, were not unlimited. By the mid-1950s, the financial calculus of maintaining the house had shifted enough that Mae made the decision to sell it. The sale, completed in 1952, returned the property to the Miami Beach real estate market and removed the last major fixed asset of the Capone estate from Mae's management. She left Florida after the sale and moved, with a quietness that attracted almost no press attention, to the Midwest. She settled eventually in a modest house in Marionette Park, a small community on the southern edge of Chicago. A return after decades to the region that had formed Al and destroyed him, conducted without announcement and without any apparent desire for recognition. The return was not nostalgic in any demonstrable sense. It was practical. Sonny was in the Chicago area. His family was there, and the proximity to her son and grandchildren provided the social structure that the Palm Island house, in its final years of her occupancy, had ceased to offer. The Marionette Park house was ordinary in every visible respect. Small, well-maintained, indistinguishable from its neighbors, in the way that Mae had always arranged her domestic environments to be indistinguishable from their surroundings. The neighbors knew who she was. The name was too prominent in Chicago's history for her presence in the area to go unrecognized. But the knowing was managed through the same mechanism that had always managed it. Mae's absolute refusal to provide anything that could be attached to a story. She attended church with the regularity that had never lapsed. She managed her modest household with the same quiet competence. She was, by the accounts of the few people who knew her in these years, a composed and self-contained woman who was not unfriendly, but who did not invite intimacy and whose interior life was not available for inspection. People who encountered her in this period described her as kind in the specific boundaried way of someone who has learned to be warm without being open, present in conversation, attentive to the person she was speaking with, entirely unrevealing about herself. Sonny's life in these years had followed a path that can only be understood against the background of everything Mae had managed on his behalf. He had married, had children, had worked at various jobs without distinction, a gas station, a restaurant, other modest enterprises that generated income without generating attention. He had changed his name at various points, attempting to establish a workable distance between himself and the identifier that had organized his entire childhood around a single, inescapable fact. The attempts were partially successful and partially not, in the way that such attempts always are. The name was too embedded in the culture to be fully escaped by its bearer, but Sonny had achieved something that his upbringing had made genuinely difficult: a quiet life, conducted below the threshold of public attention, with a wife and children who were not themselves consumed by the weight of what he carried. Mae watched this from her Marionette Park house, with what the people close to her in these years described as something like relief. The relief was not simple. It was the relief of a woman who had spent decades managing the costs that the Capone name extracted from everyone in its orbit, watching her son's life finally settle into a register that did not require that kind of management. Her own health declined gradually across the 1970s. She was in her 70s, then her 80s, navigating the ordinary physical diminishments of age in the same way she had navigated everything, quietly, practically, without complaint that reached any external record. She continued to attend church when her health permitted. She maintained her household. She accepted help from Sonny and his family when the daily demands of independent living exceeded what she could manage alone, accepting it with the same composed practicality she had always brought to the acceptance of what circumstances required. The world outside her Marionette Park house continued to consume Al Capone with an appetite that showed no signs of diminishing. Books appeared, television programs, films that cast famous actors in the role of a man she had known as a 19-year-old boy from Brooklyn, a man who had been dead for decades, but who remained more culturally present than most living people. The commercial machinery that processed his name did not require her participation and did not particularly acknowledge her existence.